Hello people, Zach here again today. As you can see today I am not in the darkness. This video is going to be about the existence of the Aether, and it's going to be building off of the previous two videos I made about the non-existence of space-time curvature. First video had more to do with the speed of light being variable, and why when you make assumptions about the ideal speed of light that it leads to need to consider the topology of space. And the second one had to do with geometry, like the fact that space doesn't have any curvature. I mean that space doesn't have any boundaries that separates its inside from its outside. So you can't even really define the concept of area and volume to even talk about it expanding in the first place, unless there is matter in space that's bounding the space, in which case you're talking about the space inside, not the space outside. And so now when you're talking about the expansion of space, what you're really talking about is the space between things expanding into the space beyond things, because the things themselves are moving in space. But that's aside the point. This video, like I said, is going to be about the existence of the Aether. And the very first thing that we're going to talk about is the Michelson Moorely experiment, because anytime you ever bring up the Aether, this is the very first thing that they say. Well, the Michelson Moorely experiment disproved the existence of the Aether. Now, the idea and the principles behind the Michelson Moorely experiment are valid, but what people fail to acknowledge is that the Michelson Moorely experiment has a particular assumption about the nature of the Aether itself built into the experiment. Specifically, they consider a static Aether. And what I mean by this is that they are considering Aether as being something that's separate from matter, that matter moves through, like it's a fluid or something. And so what the experiment is designed to do is to basically detect an Aether wind, like as matter is moving through it. If it's moving through this so-called Aether fluid, whatever it is, then that fluid should be exerting a force on the matter itself. And of course, they never detected that there was a force being exerted upon the matter. But the conclusion that they drew from this is that that because they couldn't detect an Aether wind, that the Aether doesn't exist, which is valid if you assume that's what the Aether is. But now I'm going to tell you what the Aether really is. So there's a really old game. It's called Conway's Game of Life. And I'm sure you've probably seen it before. If not, you can Google pictures of it. It's very simple. And all it is it's a 2D game where you have these grid of pixels, and you set pixels on the screen, and then you run the simulation. And there are certain rules about how these pixels changed based off of the pixels that are around them. And from these simple set of adjacency rules, you get very, very complex behaviors that end up occurring. Like you have these things called gliders that they look like little airplanes, and they kind of like walk diagonally across the screen. And then you get these emitters where like you can get two things, one thing bouncing back and forth between these two walls, and the emitter will actually create a glider, like a series of gliders that keep going through. Lots of really, really complex behaviors. But you can imagine like these gliders and these emitters, these things as being forms within this background pixel grid. And this pixel grid itself is analogous to the Aether. It's the substance that there's what stores the localized state. Now, the thing is, what the Michelson Moorely was essentially doing was like imagining that you're sitting on one of these gliders and then trying to measure that a force being exerted on the glider, like something that would have caused the glider to change or something. And then because they couldn't detect a change or couldn't detect a force being exerting on it, asserted that the grid itself didn't exist, that the substance that gives rise to the form doesn't exist. And from this perspective, you can already see where the fallacy kind of lies. They're assuming that like I said before, that the matter is moving through the Aether as opposed to being a construct of the Aether. Just like in Conway's Game of Life, in this experiment, they're assuming that the glider is something that is separate from the grid, that's moving through the grid, and that they can somehow detect the grid's existence, rather than the glider itself being a construct of the grid. And this is the reason. So the correct interpretation, if you consider what the Aether really is that what the Michelson-Moorely experiment proves is that the ether is not static, that matter itself is a construct of the ether. That is the correct interpretation. It's not that the ether doesn't exist, because to assert that the ether doesn't exist contradicts every other experiment that we've ever done that proves that it does. In particular, when you start talking about things like the fact that free space has permeability and permittivity, which is to say that it's capable of being polarized, and that polarization is what allows light to flow through free space. If that wasn't the case, light wouldn't be able to move through free space unless it was a particle, which it is not. Light is not a particle. Now, people say, well, photons are particles. No, they're quantas. They're packets of energy. When quantum mechanics says particle, what they mean is packet of energy. They don't mean classical particle. Every experiment that's ever been done has proven, without a shadow of a doubt, that the quanta of quantum mechanics are all waves. Even things like what you would call like quantum, the Compton effect and the photoelectric effect, those also prove the same, because the photoelectric effect, the emission absorption lines, you know, that come from like the quantized emission and absorption of radiation, that quantization happens specifically because of the wavelength of electrons. So this goes all the way to de Broglie model of the atom, and what led to Schrodinger's wave equation. Is the reason why we describe electrons as evolving over time in that such a way. But and then of course with the Compton effect, you're talking about a shift in frequency or wavelength. Like your shoe doesn't have wavelength and frequency. Classical particles don't have wavelength and frequency. It's in the word. It's a wave. So again, it's like you just got to kind of remind yourself, every time quantum mechanics says particle, what they really mean is packet of energy. So again, like I said, if photons are, you know, measurable, we can observe them, and every experiment that we've ever done has shown that they have these wave-like properties, and that they are waves, that means that these waves have to be propagating through something, which means that the space itself is capable of being polarized, but you can't polarize nothingness. You see where I'm getting at here? There has to be, especially not locally, space, like empty space itself, is homogeneous. So if it's homogeneous, then you can't have localized properties in space that are vary across that space. And so again, like, there's that, and then there's like quantum fluctuations. We've been able to measure. What's the word I'm looking for? I can't remember the name of the experiment, but there's an experiment that you can do where you take two plates and you stick them really, really close together, and just like, if you get them close enough together when it's happening, is that all the fluctuations that are happening in free space between the two plates end up creating a potential between them, and you can detect that. I can't remember what it's called. It's gonna have to escape me. But the fact is, like I said, we can measure these quantum fluctuations. We know that there's a wavelength of light. We know that free space has permittivity and permeability, which is neither zero nor infinite. So by every metric other than the Michelson-Moorely experiment, we know that there is an ether. But the Michelson-Moorely experiment doesn't disprove the ether. What it proves is that matter is a construct of the ether, and that the ether is not static, as being something that is separate from matter. Now, this video is probably going to be a little bit longer because I'm going to go into something else that's kind of interesting here. So, I remember reading something a long time ago. I can't remember where I saw it from, but I could have sworn it was something that was from Michael Faraday, talking about ether lumps, saying that matter was just lumps of ether. Now, I've tried finding this again. I cannot find it anywhere. I don't remember where I read it from. All I ever know is I remember reading about it. And while it's just, you might be kind of skeptical to think that Michael Faraday would have came up with this. You got to think, like, Michael Faraday was the guy who kind of worked out flux lines for like magnetic flux and electric flux, and while he was working with that stuff, he started developing this mental state where he was thinking of these flux lines as being actually real. Like, it's like he would... Me, I don't really share that exact perspective, but like, if you think, I'm thinking about it like in his mind, he was thinking that these things are actually real. And at some point he started delving into this idea that nothing is truly real, that it's all just like forces acting on forces, like it's forces all the way down. And if you try to wrap your mind around that, it's bizarre. Like, you wouldn't be able to think, like, how can you have forces without matter? It doesn't make any sense. But if we go to the Conway's Game of Life experiment, basically what he's saying is that that glider that you're looking at, all that is just a lump of pixels. But it's an arbitrarily selected lump of pixels. Like, the pixels that you see here are not the same as the ones you're going to see in 5 seconds when this glider moves across the screen. Which is to say that the glider isn't real. It's a form and a construct of the information that's there, but what's really real, like what's persistent, is not the glider, I mean, or even like the pixels per se, because the pixels, they change their state on and off all the time. What's persistent and real is the laws, like the rules of the game, the adjacency rules, and these would be akin to the forces that are acting everything. Everything is the forces. It's these adjacency rules between the elements of the ether, and that matter is just a form that arises, is like a condensate of that. But anyways, I just thought that was an interesting perspective. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.